Hello everyone. So, in a previous talk, Dr Simon Peaple and I had discussed the rise of the Nazis in regards to the Versailles Treaty. So, today we're going to talk more about the domestic factors that brought the Nazis to power in Germany. Welcome back to the programme.
Thank you for having me back.
So, last time we discussed the Versailles Treaty in regards to the rise of the Nazis. So, would it be okay if this time we elaborated more on the domestic factors that brought the Nazis to power?
Of course, delighted to deal with that section. The big sort of statement about this has always been, of course, that that what the Nazis stood for was totally abhorrent. And therefore people questioned how could Germany have ended up with them in power. And that then involves a whole number of discussions which have gone on, starting with the sort of view that the Germans were fatally attracted to some sort of totalitarian regime, and other people saying, well, they're a great liberal democracy and that they've got Goethe, and how could they end up in this situation. So it's all manner of currents and ideas that have gone into the debate. So probably the simplest thing to do is to look at the steps that did it. And Kershaw touched on this many years ago with his when he talked about in the rise to power of the way in which they were helped into power. So it's that we're going to have a look at today, the domestic factors, leaving aside the wider issues that we'd already discussed about Versailles and so on. Hopefully that will help to provide the answers you're looking for.
Thanks. So, who was it that helped them into power?
Well, I think the first thing that you need to understand about Germany in 1919, leaving aside the Versailles Treaty and all of that, Germany's revolution in 1919 seemed to be huge. The Kaiser was gone, democracy was created, it looked like a major revolution, but there were some very significant things that didn't change. So, in 1918, the Groener-Ebert Pact was designed to avoid what happened in Russia. Remember, the German General Staff had helped to get Lenin to Russia, believing he would want to take Russia out of the war and therefore give them respite by finishing the war on the Eastern Front. And that proved correct. And at the time, the fact that the Bolsheviks were calling for rank distinctions in the army to be taken away, for complete lack of fighting, etc., there was no point, ending the capitalist war, publishing all the secret treaties, all of that was great from the German point of view, as long as it applied to Russia. However, in 1918, with defeat staring them in the face in that November, the German High Command realised that they needed to control the German Revolution. And during the war, the potential for a truly left-wing revolution had opened up, in that the USPD broke away from the SPD. So the SPD was the mainstream socialist party, which had decided to back the war, crucially, in 1914, in so-called Bruderbund, Brothers Union. And the problem was that there were people within the SPD, people like Liebknecht, who understood that that was not the tradition of some, at least, of the German socialist movement. Reformists like Bernstein had come to dominate it, but actually there were proper, if you like, left-wing views that the war was a bad thing, that the control of society by the German High Command was not good, And of course they weren't winning the war either, so they were the first to start pointing out, well, if we're winning, how come that we've all got nothing to eat? It's a funny way of winning. So all of that meant that the German High Command were very concerned that a real revolution could take place in Germany. And of course the mutiny by the naval forces at Kiel only emphasised, we are teetering on the brink of a major disaster. So as the Kaiser was being told by one set of commanders, you got to go, and that was being done in one set of offices at Spa in Belgium and elsewhere, telling the Kaiser, that's it now, you are done. There were other conversations, and the Groener-Ebert Pact encapsulates those, where General Groener talks to Ebert, the leader of the SPD, the mainstream socialists, and says to him, but to them through him, we don't want a Russian-style revolution. And Ebert was no keener on that than anyone else. So, therefore, to block the extreme left, the army agreed that they would protect and support Ebert in forming a government. So Germany would get a socialist government, the SPD, the largest party, perfectly reasonable, but it was going to be guaranteed by the army so that there would be no extreme left-wing decisions reached about taking away the status of the army. So the German officer corps retained its key role in society despite the revolution, and they are one of the key groups of people that will begin to help the Nazis into power in time. They were fervently anti-socialist and would remain that way. And when you look at things like the decision to crush the Red Republic in Munich, when you look at the way in which the army stood aside during the Kapp Putsch, when it should have said, we're not going to allow a right-wing fanatic to seize power. And so when the left challenged, the army stood by the government. When the right challenged, the army stood neutral. It was a very ambiguous relationship, even from the beginning. And that was how it worked out. So one of the key things that you have to understand is that German society was already loaded in favour of the political right and of a group of people who had not ceased to be the main people in Germany. There's no confiscation of royal monies. There's, it's almost like Kaiser's gone into exile, but he's still got his bank accounts. People with titles have still got titles. There isn't a mass rush to a sort of German version of the guillotine to get rid of people. There's a very strong sense in which Germany is only changing socially as much as it has to. And in one sense, of course, they had the advantage that the revolution had already happened. You look at other countries, Britain, for example, all men now get the vote over the age of 21, which is a big change. The fact that women also get the vote on a more restricted basis is another big change. The Germans already had universal male suffrage. So their new parliament was actually being elected by the same people who could elect the last parliament. So it's not the same revolution, but it looks amazing. And it looks like a real change because this hugely central figure of the Kaiser has been removed. But he's only in exile. And there were always people, Hindenburg most notably, who were looking at whether they could bring the Kaiser back to power. Bring him back. Yes, perhaps as a more constitutional monarch like the British had, not necessarily as the Supreme Warlord and all that, because he didn't prove very good at that. But nonetheless, that they were looking at, could they bring him back? So there's another group, the aristocracy, who have retained their titles, retained their positions, largely retained their lands. Obviously some of them were impacted by the international treaty changes, but they were only impacted on them because of the international treaties, not because of anything that was done within Germany to them. So we've got a situation where you've got a society which hasn't changed a great deal, even though on a surface it's changed a lot. So that's a key thing to understand. The Nazis are coming to power in a Germany which hasn't fundamentally changed beyond some of the more external obvious factors. So that helps them into power because they're not having to rebuild from nothing. They're not having to sort of strike it against a socialist government which has come to power or anything like that. Hitler himself benefits from one of the obvious points raised, and that is that when he's tried after the Munich Putsch, the judge, he is one of the old judges. So his tolerance of right-wingers, his tolerance of the way in which these people had taken on the state is entirely different because he is an old judge of the pre-Weimar era. So he's not willing to treat right-wingers in the same way as he might treat left-wingers, so who challenge the state. So there's a big issue there. You've also got, and interestingly, it parallels Japan in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. So it's a little bit earlier in Germany. But you get the political assassinations, the threat of assassination of key figures on the not right. And in the same way as in Japan, it forces the discourse towards the right, because the more moderate, the more balanced elements who might have provided opposition to a right-wing takeover are either eliminated or quietened. So it's quite, there's a bit of subtlety there, and as I say, the same thing happens in Japan, but about five years later. So we've got a society which is very much unchanged socially, which is still retaining a very strong pre-war social stratification. And then you've got the issues we talked about before, Versailles, about the reparations, all of those things which mean that Weimar inherits a poison chalice. It's not a society which is benefiting from any big run. So that's really very, very key to understanding what's happening before the Nazis rise to power, because they're in a society which is looking towards the right, and the institutions that might have benefited from a very positive swing after 1919 don't get that benefit. They get to deal with all the awkward stuff. And when you look at how Germany is treated after World War II, with the Marshall Plan, Europe being put back on its feet, support for European coal and steel community being created and so on, you can see a different attitude. And it's understandable, very understandable, that people were bitter after World War I, largely misled as to just how much their own countries had led to the war. And then Germany, has to shoulder a big amount of responsibility for the outbreak of the war. But nonetheless, that makes it easy for everyone to just go and kick them. And the net result is that the new Germany looks weak, looks out of sorts. And if you want, you could take a parallel with Yeltsin's Russia. That if you give people a hard time, if they have it, if they've had a revolution because there are no fridges, because there's never enough bread, and then you create a situation where a new democratic Russia can't deliver on those things that they need, then it doesn't work. And you know, the failure to pump lots of cheap Western goods into Russia as a kind of Marshall Plan after the revolution shows you the same problem, because then people turn around and say, well, what the new Russians treat us silly and stupid, and there's a few wealthy people benefiting and nobody else. You know, what about the good old days? And you know, you get Putin. So you can see the parallels, and maybe those parallels help to illustrate the point. It's not inevitable that these people will come to power, but it's not as odd that they do, because the circumstances, the seed bed is there. And obviously, as we discussed with regard to the Depression, you've then got a huge economic shock. And those who've lived through COVID, those who've lived through the 2008 financial crash, can have some idea, not much in comparison, one could argue, but some idea of what it must have been like, with the benefit, in our case, that those lessons had been learnt to a degree, mixed motives and so on, but nonetheless, people were told, oh well, we've got to bail out in Britain, Northern Rock, in Wall Street, Bear Stearns, or whatever, they couldn't be rescued, but others had to be, because, in Britain people said, well, if the cash machine stopped working, there'll be revolution. So we've got to bail out Northern Rock. In America, if Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac can't survive, then the whole of home owning base of America falls apart. So, they acted. Whereas if you imagine in Germany, and as had happened to a degree in the United States in 1929, people were left with the consequences. And Germany faced huge unemployment. The typical figure that's talked about that in context of the Nazis coming to power is 6 million unemployed. And if you multiply that by even 3 or 4 for the families of those people, you're looking at 24 million people who haven't got enough to live on. And that's a lot. That's a big chunk of your population. And your most radical chunk, and maybe the fact that today in Britain, people have noticed that young people are dividing between sort of the green left radicals and the reform right, makes it easier to understand why in 1929 through to 1982 there were people who were unemployed who turned to the message of socialism, and the people who turned to the message of fascism. Not to make some crude parallel between the organisations because they're different, but people look for answers against a big problem. And when you have little problems, you make choices in the middle. When you have big problems, more people reach for the left or the right. And this is what was happening. There was increasing polarisation. And therefore, from 1929 onwards, Germany is in crisis. If we go back to the point about the army, in 1925, Hindenburg had been elected as President of Germany. And therefore, Hindenburg, great war hero, associated with victory in the East, less with defeat in the West, but benefiting from the fact that all the stab in the back stuff had kind of made it look like he hadn't really lost the war. So Hindenburg is president, and everybody can feel quite comfortable. It's reassuring. It's the past. He is one of these key people who wants to bring back the Kaiser if he can. So all of that's going on. And in 1928, Muller resigns as Chancellor. And after that point, Hindenburg will not go to the left for a government. And it's very hard to see how, if he's not prepared to appoint a left-wing government or a left-centre government, what option is there except for the centre/centre-right? And you can see the narrowing of options. You could take a parallel, if you like, that once France decides to ally with Russia, then war in the Balkans begins to have significance. Once Hindenburg has made his mind up that he will not appoint a left-wing or left-inclusive government, what choice has he got? And initially, in the face of the crisis, he'll appoint a moderate right-wing government. But that moderate right-wing government cannot achieve an end to the crisis. Now, at that point, a less politically blind president would have said, I might need to get everybody together. Or I might need to get, a recreation of, the Corona government with the current government with, let's see if we can get that together. And that would have offered mass support, because, one thing to remember is that what Hindenburg tried to do was create a government of people who had no political base. The so-called who's who government was effectively that. Papen as Chancellor was his mate, the sort of guy he liked to have dinner with. Bit of a contrast, the Hindenburg, the old Prussian who still slept on a military-style camp bed at the age of 84, compared to the, Franz Papen, who speaks 6 languages, is art, culture, critic, all of those things. The rounded officer with education and style and whatever else. So it's fine. You could argue he's got as much idea about how he might run the country as anyone else. But Schleicher had been doing something really important. Schleicher had been reaching out, not to the left politically, but to the left basis of support by running job creation programs, by putting people into work. Now, it was pretty unimaginative stuff, converting barracks into homes, but that was actually fine. That was beginning to dent the support for not just the hard left, but also the hard right. The Nazi vote stalls in mid-32 amid Schleicher's efforts to keep the whole thing in a more reasonable manner. Replacing him with Papen takes away the opportunity for what you could call the non-Nazi right to access popular support. Papen has no party political support, other than that he's the president's mate. Doesn't mean he's initially a bad man, just a bit clueless. And very much undermines the work that Schleicher had done. But nobody really appreciated that as the practical reality. So Papen, having lost power to Schleicher, then wants it back. What does he do about it? Well, he ends up trying to do a deal with the Nazis. Now, the Nazis had seen big gains from 1928 to 30, massive change. 32, they're the biggest party in the Reichstag. Why? Well, their support is large, but it's also drawn off particular areas. And interestingly, not the areas the Nazis had particularly tried to win over. The classic is Berlin, Goebbels was made the Gauleiter of Berlin. His job was to turn it from red to Nazi. Completely failed. I mean, obviously some people changed, but they really could not break that hold. In the Catholic Ruhr, they couldn't break it. For all that the Catholic Church subsequently made a deal with the Nazi regime once it was established, Catholic voters were one of the least fertile grounds for Nazi propaganda, because they already had very strong local community groups and political alignments. So they just could not break through. So it's very interesting that where their vote is coming from is particularly the middle class, who had been dispossessed by the savings, by first of all the inflation and then the failure of the savings banks. And the Austrian Credit Anstalt Bank went down, and when that went down, a whole load of savings banks went down. And you've got to bear in mind that middle class people in those days, what made them middle class? They were professionals, they weren't working with their hands usually, or if they were skilled in particular ways like draftsmen, things like that. But also it was their ability to save. How were they going to have a life after work? Not for very long perhaps, not for, but in the pre-pension age, Social Security was there in Germany, there were pensions were available, but a lot of it was self-funded. So putting the money in the bank was their way of securing their future. And what happens? They lose it. And they turn to people who say the problem is international capitalism. Not the Marxists, because that's where your class bit crashes, but with the Nazis. You say, well, that's a problem. Now, of course, fringe of that, then we're getting into anti-Semitism and all those things. But from a practical point of view, you've been saving for your time. You lost money in the inflation. You then save up again for your pension, and then it gets wiped out. You're very bitter. You don't naturally turn to the left, because that's the workers' party and you're not the workers. So you turn to the Nazis. And rural areas, particularly, were Nazis. The Nazis originally hadn't looked at that at all, and developed their rural policy almost in response. Goodness me, there's always people want to vote for us. What can we say to them? So it's a funny political journey, but that's where they're drawing big support from. So their growth gets stymied by Schleicher, but then Schleicher is under attack from von Papen. So what does von Papen do? And he says, well, initially he says to his mate Hindenburg, well, I could be Chancellor again, and I'll do a deal with Hitler, and he can, be my Vice-Chancellor, which would give Papen the popular base of support that he hadn't had initially. But that doesn't work, because Hitler won't do the deal. Hitler realises that Papen needs him more than he needs Papen, although it's not as clear cut as that. But nonetheless, there is that, there's the gambler's turn. Now Schleicher thinks, oh, well, I can do a deal with the Nazis, I'll talk to the Stracers, who are fed up with Hitler, always dominating, always telling everybody what to do. So he does a deal with the Stracers. But what happens? The Stracers are able to not get anywhere with the Nazi Party. Hitler's very shrewd. Hitler moves carefully and eliminates the Stracers from the party machine, and therefore they lose. And then critically we get the Leap elections. Now, Leap was a small provincial area, late 32, it's due for its regional elections. And even Hitler recognises this. And it's interesting because it's one of the few documented times when we can see him give money of his rather than the party's. And so what he does is he puts some money into that campaign. Now, the Nazis appear to have stalled, remember, late 32, they haven't grown, so it looks like maybe the bubble's bursting. But you've got some provincial elections. And the point is, the provincial elections are due for the first time since 1928. And 1928 was pre the Depression. So any elections there would need to sort of catch up with the political map for 1933. And modern day sophology would be saying, well, based on the trends then and now and paralleling other areas in similar types, it would all be worked out. And somebody would be saying, well, the Nazis should achieve X percentage of the vote by that point. But of course they don't, because it's not as modern, it's not as integrated. So what hits people is, massive gain for the Nazis in the Leap elections. They are not stymied, they are moving forward. And of course that's exactly what isn't the case. But it becomes the key point. So Hitler then, having sorted the Stracers, got the regional result in Leap that he wants, is in a position to say to Papen, look, the price of getting crucial Nazi party support for your government is Hitler as Chancellor. And von Papen, in the negotiations, can't get round that roadblock. Now that's where I'm saying that Hindenburg's view is really important. Because if Hindenburg really didn't want Hitler, and there's often comments made that, Hindenburg looked down his nose at Hitler, he was only a corporal, how could he be Chancellor of Germany, the Ludendorff warning him that he's a disaster, etc. All of those things are negatived by the fact that he won't pick up the alternative option, which is to ring the socialists and say, I think we need a discussion between the middle ground and the left. If he really didn't want Hitler, he had an option, but he didn't want to take that option. Even though Hitler had stood against him in the 1932 presidential election, which had offended Hindenburg deeply, but it of course made Hitler massively well known. The Hitler over Germany campaign had really put him on the map across the whole of Germany. And very critically, there had been a significant vote for Hitler. So although he lost, which was predictable, because at the end of the day in a runoff between Hindenburg and Hitler, any left-wing minded voters would have voted for Hindenburg. But it demonstrates how difficult it was, because Hindenburg would not exercise that political option. So he only had to choose Papen plus Hitler or Hitler plus Papen. That's not a very good choice to be in. And Hindenburg then agrees on that basis to make Hitler Chancellor. So we've got Hitler at the head of a government, which is not because he's stormed to electoral victory over Germany, but because he is the main party of the right. That Hindenburg won't choose anything else. Now what happens then is that Hitler agrees with von Papen and Hindenburg that there will be elections, that the new government will be announced, and then there will be elections. And of course those elections are brutally exploited by the Nazis, who get away with murder literally and metaphorically in terms of the rules. People are arrested. Most of the communists are, by the time the elections are over, most of the communist deputies are not able to attend either because they're in hospital, they're in exile. So there's, you know, absolutely brutal moment where the Nazis abuse all their power. But how can they do that? Partly because the police, the judiciary, the army have all been unreformed. And because they're unreformed, they have a willingness to accept the rise of a person who is going to do what they want. And famously, of course, on the 2nd of February, 3 days after becoming Chancellor, Hitler meets the leaders of the army and says, "We will rearm. You will have more rearmament than you dreamt of." So the army as an institution is bought by the Nazis as it comes into power, so that it tolerates the rise of the Nazis through the elections. And then when the enabling bill is brought before the Reichstag, you know, not only have you got popular groups outside, you know, chanting "Give us the bill" or "Fire or murder," you know, famous sort of getting the streets out, but the people in the room aren't voting against you, and much to their discredit, the Catholic Party votes for the enabling bill rather than against it, which would have broken the political requirement. But they too, faced with a right-wing power which has got control, now deal with it as a controlling power, which makes it harder for anyone to step aside. So I hope that offers a step-by-step approach. How did they get there? How did it happen? And then, you know, one can explore all the other political issues, but that's, if you like, the way into office that gives you a Nazi government with an enabling bill that gives it power for 4 years. And as we all know, by the end of that 4 years, there was no one left to take power back.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to Millie and Elfie for not barking during the interview.
Well, thank you very much for having me back. I hope it was useful and interesting.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peaple, for talking to us again, and hopefully this was a useful talk to everyone and a good follow-up to our previous video, and it was lovely having you here